I've told you that Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump's anti-Muslim and sort of nativist rhetoric is not going to help anything, and it will probably create even more enemies and make it easier for terrorist groups to recruit. We have now learned that Donald Trump is indeed featured in a new recruitment video from the terrorist group Al-Shabaab, according to numerous experts. Evan Coleman, who's an analyst with NBC News and chief R&D officer for the private intelligence firm Flashpoint, was one of the first to identify Trump in this new video. He tweeted out, quote, "A new video from Al-Shabaab in Somalia shows Donald Trump calling for a ban on Muslims and warns basic human rights do not apply in the United States." And we've talked about Al-Shabaab before. It's an Al-Qaeda-linked militant group based in Somalia. They're best known, I guess, to the extent that terrorists are known for stuff, for a big attack on a Kenyan mall in 2003. And Coleman says that Trump appearing in this video signifies that he has a larger utility for the broader jihadist movement. Trump appears about 10 minutes into the video. And, when we go back to the last Democratic debate, Hillary Clinton said Donald Trump is in ISIS recruitment videos. That was fact checked. And at the time, it was determined to be untrue. Now, though, Donald Trump showing up in an Al-Shabaab recruiting video. And I think the bigger point, Lewis, is the type of anti-Muslim rhetoric we hear from Trump is useful to Islamic jihadists for recruiting, aside from whether it's ISIS or Al-Shabaab or whoever.
I think so. Still, in the broader scheme of things, it's not even close. It's not even close, Dave, to the most hateful anti-Islamic speech that is out there, right?
No.
There's far, far worse. So I'm not sure.
But is it coming from as prominent of a person is the question.
I suppose that's it. Here we have, the Republican frontrunner for president. And so, I mean, I guess that makes it a bit more useful as a recruitment tool.
And again, I'm no defender of Hillary Clinton. She said Trump was in ISIS videos, and he wasn't to the extent that it was fact-checked. But she's right about the underlying point. Trump's anti-Muslim rhetoric has and will continue to be used by jihadists as a recruitment tool. And I guess Trump can blame Hillary, right? He can say, hey, look, Hillary Clinton gave Al-Shabaab the idea of using me in their videos when she mentioned that at the debate. She's helping the terrorists recruit. That's the line I would expect from Trump.
Probably. And I also might expect Trump to be flattered that he's being used in these videos. For him, it's probably just more publicity, and any publicity is good publicity.
Imagine how quickly he went from just hiring undocumented immigrants in the United States to build buildings and having Mexicans make his suits in Mexico to now criticizing undocumented immigrants and being featured in Islamic jihadist recruiting videos. He's really come a long way in the last couple of years.
Yeah, I don't know where else he needs to be popping up. Maybe in porn or something like that. That's all there is that's left.
New Hampshire State Representative Josh Moore is a self-described pro-family conservative and naturally a Republican as well. He recently said that unless exposing breasts in public during breastfeeding is banned, he should be allowed to grab the nipples of breastfeeding mothers. He posted this comment to his Facebook page. Then he deleted it after all hell broke loose. But thanks to the advent of taking screenshots and the print screen button on modern keyboards, we do have a record of his statement where he said, "Who doesn't support a mother's right to feed? Don't give me the liberal talking points, Amanda. If it's a woman's natural inclination to pull her nipple out in public, no problem. And you support that. You should have no problem with a man's inclination to stare at it and grab it. After all, it's all relative and natural, right?" Now, the Amanda he's referring to is New Hampshire State Rep Amanda Bolden, who was shocked and appalled, understandably, that New Hampshire Republicans were trying to effectively ban breastfeeding in public. In New Hampshire, currently, both men and women are allowed to go topless. And that's actually the case in a lot of places. In New York City, that's the case, many other places. And there's a Republican-sponsored bill which wants to change that so that women could be charged with a misdemeanor if they purposely expose the areola or nipple of their breasts in a public place. Since when do family values include grabbing the nipples of women breastfeeding in public? That doesn't sound like family values, does it?
No, I just think it's really strange, the whole movement to try and suppress things
Yeah.
that are perfectly normal, naturally occurring things that are supposed to happen.
Yeah.
So I don't, of course, I think that this is a lame comparison, and, when I see someone breastfeeding, Dave, I don't have the inclination to go grab the nipple.
Right.
Maybe that is a problem for Josh Moore, but I don't know. What about you?
No, it doesn't happen to me either. And what this really is a part of that lunatic, authoritarian, strict father, supposedly Bible-based morality, right? No birth control. You either don't have sex or you have children and you take care of them. And when you're married, women had better be popping those children out. But when they do and they have to feed those children, it had damn well better be in private because of, decency and areolas and stuff. And there's also the moronic equation of breastfeeding and indecent exposure, which is what underlies this. Oh, women are exposing themselves in public in an indecent way when they're feeding children, and we got to ban that. We've got to put that in the back room.
Yeah, what is indecent exposure? How do you define that? I mean, would he like to see charges against a woman who accidentally has her clothes ripped off by an escalator or something like that? I mean, would there be indecent exposure charges there?
Can we step back for a second and think about how insane this country is with the breast stuff? You can come up with any way possible to expose the base of the breast, right? It can stick out to the side of your shirt, on top, below. Anything's fair game. But God forbid you see nipple, Lewis. That ruins lives.
You know what's funny? This is not someone I really look to for anything, but Miley Cyrus said the exact same thing.
Really?
She said that the country loves breasts and they're everywhere, but everyone's terrified of the nipple.
And then the other hypocrisy is also that if a woman who is relatively flat-chested exposes her chest, that is wrong in many cases. But a man with any size man boobs, or I guess the right term is gynecomastia if we're speaking medically here, which I try to do, that's fine. I mean, just the absurdity of it. I will never understand this obsession with breasts.
I mean, it goes back a long ways because at one point they were sexualized, right? In many countries they aren't. And they're just out there all the time. And so, a long time ago, Dave, everything was covered up, much like many women in the Middle East now.
And in many places, nothing is covered up also. Let's consider that.
Yeah, and there was a time when even showing your ankle was considered pretty, flirtatious and risque and maybe even obscene.
Yeah.
And now I guess we've kind of retreated all the way back to the nipple. The nipple is like the last stand.
Yeah.
If we can get by the nipple, we're in the clear.
Oh, yeah. Even though nipples may seem small, they represent something huge in terms of the obstruction that they are responsible for in society. I like that, Lewis. Very, very good analysis. President Obama announced executive action on gun safety legislation, and the gun nuts are going crazy. And to be honest, I don't really know why because, we'll talk about why. The White House has made a big announcement. They have figured out all of the legal options available for President Obama to take unilateral executive action on gun safety legislation. And they've come up with a few different areas, and we're going to take a look at those now. First and foremost is that of requiring background checks for people buying weapons through trusts, corporations, etc. And what a lot of this has to do with is the idea that if there are certain times where you can buy a gun and avoid a background check. This often known as the gun show loophole. This also includes a few other ways in which the individual who will ultimately have the gun and be using it can avoid having a background check. We also have seen in this release from the White House that the ATF will be expanded. Money for new agents is going to be provided. We will also be putting in place a system to track online firearms trafficking. There will be an increase in the mental health reporting of the background check system, which will allow, it will put in place a system to prevent those who have been identified as mentally ill from legally obtaining firearms. We will also be looking at, we have one item on there twice for some reason. I guess Lewis really, really liked that item. He just wanted me to list it twice, requiring background checks for people regardless of how they buy the weapons. And lastly, looking at future gun safety technology, the federal government wants to be kept apprised, Lewis, of developments with smart guns, for example, and new technologies, which then could potentially be mandatory with regard to new guns produced beyond a certain period in time. The background check issue is absolutely huge. I mean, there is no qualifier needed. If you buy a gun, there should be a background check, period. If you buy it at a gun show, it shouldn't be any different.
Yeah, background checks. It makes sense. They're not always going to work, though. And yeah, sometimes you just don't know who is crazy and who has lost their mind. So, it's the people who say that this isn't going to stop all mass shootings, all gun-related crimes. They're right, but it's going to help. And anything that helps, I think we are in favor of.
Requiring that people take a driver's test is not going to prevent every drunk driving accident. Even if in driver's ed, everybody is told you shouldn't drive drunk. That's not a reason not to do that, right? Now, there are some problems with this. The biggest problem for me is that this isn't really that big of a deal. I mean, the gun nuts are going crazy, and there are some important changes here, but this is not going to broadly change the problem we have with guns in the United States. That's the biggest problem I have with it.
Yeah, it won't, but there's only so much the president can do. There's only so much we can do. People are going to own guns. There are going to be tons of guns unaccounted for.
Right.
And it's going to be a problem for decades and decades, and maybe longer.
And in looking at some of the specifics, the reduction of barriers, making it easier for mental health professionals to communicate to the federal government that a particular individual is probably not in a mental state where they should own a gun, that to me is potentially problematic, because while it absolutely needs to happen, it also is an incentive for people not to seek mental health help, right? That if you think, oh, I am having some problems and I really should be talking to someone, but if I do, they might communicate to the federal government that I should not have a firearm. Now I am going to avoid getting mental health services, and that could really be a problem.
It could be. I think that if someone is going to avoid it for that reason, they're probably someone who's going to avoid it anyway. But I think we're only talking about a small amount of cases with regard to that.
The bigger number of cases comes in people who just hear that President Obama is taking executive action and they go out and buy guns in a panic. CNN did a report this morning, which I watched. They went to a gun show. People just, to quote Lewis, fervently, I know it's not a real word. Every time I say it, people email me. People fervently buying guns because they say, oh, Obama's going to take our guns. And the most notable thing about this entire executive action is it does not do any taking of guns. And I think that that's an important fact that a lot of these gun nuts are missing.
Maybe, but I think according to some of these nuts, even if you are mentally ill, it's still your constitutional right to buy a gun, right?
Yes, no question. There are some people who believe that. There should be strict gun safety rules. They should apply to everyone, myself included. If I want a gun, first, I should have a background check. Then I should have a meeting with a properly trained official to discuss why I want the gun, which can also serve as an opportunity for an official to sort of suss out whether I might be off my rocker, so to speak. Once I pass that, I would be allowed to buy gun insurance. Every gun owner should have to have insurance for the guns that they own. And then after that, I could get my gun. And during the period of time where I have that gun, I should have to be relicensed every once in a while. This would include a class that updates me on changes to gun regulations. This is just a basic thing, Lewis. This is what we need. Everybody should have that.
Yeah. But Dave, you're making life complicated for a lot of people, right? And that's the argument. But there's a gun crime epidemic in this country.
There is.
And some people think that as long as they have a gun, they won't be affected by it.
Okay, last week, Donald Trump said it. He said he would start pouring money into TV ads, millions maybe. We didn't know what to expect. We have now had a look, and it is hilarious. Trump's first ad shows footage of people swarming over a border fence, talking about stopping illegal immigration by building a wall to Mexico that Mexico will pay for. The video has been fact-checked. It turns out that the footage used is from Africa. The footage used is from Morocco. Let's take a look at the ad. Let's listen to the ad and then discuss.
I'm Donald Trump, and I approve this message.
The politicians can pretend it's something else, but Donald Trump calls it radical Islamic terrorism. That's why he's calling for a temporary shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until we can figure out what's going on.
Right.
He'll quickly cut the head off ISIS and take their oil. and he'll stop illegal immigration by building a wall on our southern border that Mexico will pay for.
We will make America great again.
It is everything I could have hoped for, Lewis. He is going to cut off ISIS's head and take their oil. I mean, it's written as if it's just an action-adventure book where you just go and do whatever the hell you want. But the real issue here is that PolitiFact has fact-checked the video. They have traced that footage during which you hear them talking about Mexican immigration to the U.S. They have traced that back to an Italian television network. It is video of people crossing from Morocco into Spain. Once the Trump campaign was called out of this, the Trump campaign put out a statement saying, yeah, we did it intentionally to show how bad open borders are, because that's how bad it would get if we didn't build the wall to Mexico. Quite an explanation, Lewis, for what is clearly misleading video.
I'm sure there was just no video that was readily available that was good enough to put in the ad, and they thought that no one would really notice.
And you'd think if immigration from Mexico was so bad, undocumented immigration, they would be able to come up with some video of it.
Yeah. Where is the video of just, crowds, mobs of people fleeing, over the border? Maybe it's happened before. I really doubt it. They usually try and keep a low profile because Border Patrol and whatnot. Also, you're in the middle of the desert. It's just not really like Trump makes it sound. I know there is a problem,
right?
But it's not like, it's not like that video.
The other reason it's hard to find that video is because the problem is not nearly as bad as Donald Trump would have you think. The Pew Research Center study recently illuminated that for the first time since the 1940s, more immigrants from Mexico are leaving the U.S., going back to Mexico than coming into the country. We have a net outflow of Mexicans from the U.S. to Mexico. That is not a fact you're going to find on any Trump ad or stump speech anytime soon.
Yeah. They are, if Trump wins, I'll move to Mexico. That's the new one, I guess. Maybe more of them will leave if Trump wins. But does that sound bad? Maybe more of them will leave if Trump wins. That might have come out the wrong way.
Yes, but we know you didn't mean anything by it. I mean, you were making a political point rather than any sort of criticism of anybody.
Anyway, it's fascinating that Trump is pretty much only using fear to run his entire campaign.
I've been waiting for Donald Trump to finally question whether Ted Cruz is eligible to be president of the United States. Donald Trump, one of the most well-known birthers, demanding, swearing up and down that we must see President Obama's birth certificate, the long form, not the short form, Lewis, because obviously anybody can fake a short form birth certificate. Faking the long form would be much more difficult. So I've been waiting for presidential candidate Donald Trump to ask for or question Ted Cruz's citizenship and eligibility to be president, and he finally has. Trump said in an interview with the Washington Post that Republican voters should think twice before voting for Ted Cruz because there could be challenges to his eligibility to be president, which could tie him up in court for several years. Here's a clip of Trump talking about the same thing in an interview.
What it all means, I know that other people are talking about it.
Donald Trump deflecting last night in New Hampshire. The frontrunner saying Republican rival Ted Cruz's natural-born citizenship is a question that only other people are asking.
People are worried that if he weren't born in this country, which he wasn't, he was born in Canada,
right?
And he actually had a Canadian passport along with a U.S. passport.
Trump said in an earlier interview with the Washington Post that Cruz being born in Canada could be very precarious for the GOP, asking Republican voters to think twice, saying, do we want a candidate who could be tied up in court for 2 years? That'd be a big problem. Trump hinting Democrats could take Cruz to court because the Constitution requires the president to be a natural-born citizen. The junior senator was granted citizenship by birth since his mother was an American citizen. But what constitutes natural-born for a president has never been tested in court.
I think I'm going to let my response stick with that tweet.
So Ted Cruz held dual U.S.-Canadian citizenship. He renounced his Canadian citizenship back in May of 2014. And Trump has sort of gone back and forth on this. First, he said, it could be problematic. But then last September, he said, lawyers have checked it out and it's absolutely clear. I have to be very clear here. I want clarity this evening. I applaud Donald Trump because it would be hugely hypocritical to go after President Obama along birther lines and not go after Cruz among birther lines. After all, President Obama was born in the United States. I happen to believe both Ted Cruz and President Obama are eligible to be president. But a very superficial analysis tells us that Ted Cruz's situation is more questionable than President Obama's, merely along the lines of the definition of natural born. He was granted U.S. citizenship in spite of being born in another country because of the citizenship of a parent. That's slightly more complex than President Obama being born to a U.S. citizen mother in the United States. I believe both are eligible, but you've got to go after Cruz. If you ever said anything about Obama, you've got to be going after Cruz.
Well, he's kind of passive aggressively going after Cruz, right? Because he's saying, I believe Cruz is eligible. Cruz, was a U.S. citizen. But he's saying, okay, well, the Democrats might go after him. This could be a problem. He might be tied up in court.
Birther Democrats are going to cause a problem.
Yeah, birther Democrats, which, actually, I think if he were to become the president, would be fine. Let's be as immature as the Republicans were during Obama's presidency, create distractions and just make noise.
I'm going to go a step further, Lewis. Until Ted Cruz produces his mother's birth certificate, I won't believe that he's eligible. She is his only connection to America. Go Trump, make America great again. It'll be terrific. It'll be absolutely terrific.
I actually heard that she's from Pluto.
Which is not even a planet anymore. I mean, if she was from another planet, fine. Pluto is not even a planet anymore. That doesn't make any sense to me. That's certainly nothing natural born about that.
Oh, Dave, an expert told me. Someone who knows.
Respected statistician and polling guru Nate Silver says the chance of Bernie Sanders winning the Democratic Party's nomination is close to zero, and that Donald Trump has a better shot at being the Republican nominee than does Bernie Sanders of being the Democratic nominee. Nate Silver correctly predicted the election results of all 50 states in 2012. I did too, by the way. I think if you just went by state polls, it wasn't that difficult to do. And he told Adweek that Hillary Clinton will likely win the Democratic nomination unless there's some sort of renewed scandal or a health problem that really changes things. He said, quote, I could see Bernie Sanders winning a few states. New Hampshire is still very close, but Clinton's chances have to be in the range of 90 to 95%. Trump has more of a chance than Bernie. Not thrilling, Lewis, to many progressives.
No, I don't like hearing that, but I think that's the kind of the view that we've had for a while. It's what the data suggests. It's unfortunate. I mean, could he be wrong?
He absolutely could be wrong. We'll talk to Bill Scher about this a little bit later today. Nate Silver also said that Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump's chances of winnings are also incredibly low, and he says they will have more detailed statistical analyses of these probabilities very soon, saying about Trump, I don't think his chances are zero. You have to be very careful about saying they're zero, but I think they're lower than 20 or 25%. Maybe they're 10%, maybe they're 8%. I'm not sure, somewhere in that range. So we now have experts, Lewis, with excellent records at predicting elections with conflicting predictions. Nate Silver, 100% accurate in 2012, says Bernie will not win. Western Illinois University, successfully predicting every single presidential election since 1975, says Bernie Sanders will win. One of the experts is going to be wrong here.
Yeah, well, I guess we could look at when are they providing this information? At what point are they making the prediction? It seems that at Western Illinois, they make these predictions relatively early.
Right. But they've still been right.
They've still been right, yeah. And so, yeah, you're right. I mean, usually Nate Silver waits a little while before he tells us who is going to be the president. And so
he seems to think that it is just so unlikely that Trump or Bernie will be the nominees that even without looking at whether it's an 8 or 20% chance, that he's comfortable saying something. And that I'm not writing off Nate Silver by any means. I'm merely pointing out that the so-called experts are not in agreement here with regard to their predictions. Let's take a break. I'm on Twitter at Pakman. Lewis is on Twitter at Lewis Motomedy. Follow us, tweet us. We'll be back after this.
Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to be joined once again by Tim Wise, anti-racist educator and author of 6 books, including White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son. Tim, we've been following with great interest the impact that Donald Trump's candidacy in the Republican primary has had on sort of coalescing and catalyzing the white supremacist movement. We've seen endorsements from people like David Duke, former KKK member. We've seen the white supremacist website Stormfront have to literally upgrade servers to account for the traffic that is coming to them as a result of the Trump presidency. Talk to us about your analysis of Trump and sort of coalescing this racist vote.
Well, this has been a long-term political project for the far right, going back really to the Wallace days in the late 60s, and certainly, extending through, let's say, the David Duke campaigns in Louisiana in 90 and 91 for U.S. Senate and governor, which I was involved in defeating him at that time in an organization there. And I think what the right's been trying to do is find a candidate who would do the same thing Duke did, the same thing Wallace did, which is scapegoat people of color, scapegoat religious minorities, scapegoat poor folks. In the case of Donald Trump, scapegoat immigrants, which is something Duke also did, for problems that they did not create, because part of the right-wing backlash to the civil rights movement, the right-wing backlash to the women's movement, the right-wing backlash to just about every form of social progress in the past 100 years has been about doing that, has been about taking real, legitimate economic problems that working class folks face, and then putting a face on those problems that is brown, that is black, that is foreign. So it isn't just the overt white nationalist, though I'm sure they're very pleased to have someone like Trump who never wore a swastika or a Klan robe and did not stand in the schoolhouse door like Wallace and say segregation forever, to be able to coalesce some of those views. Having said that, it's also really galvanizing not just those folks, but a larger mass of white folks who are gripped in nostalgia for an America that they look at very fondly because they can, because it worked for them. And they see change. They see cultural change, economic change, political change. And part of the reactionary mind is a fear of ambiguity, a fear of uncertainty, a fear of change. That's the thing I think we as Americans have to get our heads around. It isn't enough to talk about the connections to white nationalists and white supremacists. It's really about how Trump is galvanizing white anxiety in a way that the Tea Party a few years ago could only have dreamt of.
This may be a sort of esoteric question, and maybe there is no productive answer to it, but do you feel that the Trump ideas around these issues are working more out of fear and anxiety or out of anger?
I think those things go together. I think we have a perfect storm of white anxiety in this country. I wrote about that in my book, Dear White America, 4 years ago. And that perfect storm was created by four factors that were working together. One was the election of a president of color with a strange, exotic name, who many didn't even view as American, and it challenged the idea of what the president should look like. The second factor was the economic insecurity caused by the recession in 07, 08, which was confronting white folks with double-digit unemployment for the first time since the Great Depression. Then you had the cultural change. Now we have a popular culture, thoroughly multicultural, so it's not in the hands of the same folks it always was. And then finally, the demographic shift, whereby in 30 years, half the country will be folks of color, half will be white. All of that was happening at the same time, which I think generated white anxiety. Now, the anger comes from that anxiety, because if you have always been someone who was able to look at you and yours and say, we are Americans, we're what an American is, we're the prototype, the floor model of an American, and now you're confronted with a reality that you're going to have to share that designation with people who don't look like you, don't pray like you, have different customs than you. That can generate not only anxiety and fear, but also a lot of anger and hostility and the sense that you're being victimized. This white victimization, which David Duke and white supremacists have been playing upon with, phony arguments and phony analysis and bad data for a long time, has now become mainstream. So the problem, and we said this during the anti-Duke campaigns in the early 90s, is not so much Duke as it was Dukeism. Now it's not so much Trump as it is Trumpism.
Yeah, and along those lines, I'm curious as to, I've spoken to some political analysts, Bill Scher, for example, and several others, who all along have been saying Donald Trump very quickly got to his maximum level of support because of these ideas that he's presenting. He's the only person presenting some of these ideas, and he's presenting them in a way that really appeals to a particular group of people. Along those lines, do you believe that Donald Trump is merely coalescing individuals that already had these ideas, or sort of these ideas resonated with a particular group? Or do you think he's actually convincing anybody of anything? Is he changing minds, or is he simply coalescing those who already had these thoughts?
I think he's mostly galvanizing the core, the true believers, but there are an awful lot of folks out there who are prone to the politics of scapegoating and blame. And I think a lot of people who are afraid, whether it is of job insecurity or whether it is of terrorism, who can be persuaded by the kind of simplistic but hyper nationalistic, rah-rah patriotic kind of argument that Trump is making. So the difference I have with mainstream political scientists in this regard is that when they say, you know, he's topped out, it's over. People said that about David Duke in 1990 and 91. And what we knew then was that he was, as we said, flying below radar. He might be polling 25%, but there were people who would not tell pollsters that they were going to vote for him because they knew at some level it was something wrong. And we've already seen there are some polls saying that right now. The hardcore, you know, sort of working class, disaffected white masses have pretty much topped out. If they're going to support Trump, they already are. But there are these surveys that have been taken that find college-educated professional white folks who are not struggling necessarily, who are not working class, who are apparently not telling pollsters that they support Donald Trump, but in fact are. So the idea that he has topped out, I think, is a very dangerous conceit that traditional political science is assuming based on part of the history that they're exploring, but they're ignoring some other lessons. And in Louisiana, we saw David Duke very nearly won that Senate race in 1990, got 44% of the vote, 60% of the white vote. You know, if Donald Trump manages to get the nomination and get 60, 65, he would need more than 60 probably, but 62, 3, 4% of the white vote, he in fact could win the Electoral College in this country. So even though I don't think that will happen, I think it's dangerous to assume that it won't.
So that's sort of the dynamic on the right. What's your sense of, 2008 and 2012? There was a significant number of newly engaged voters. The prospect of an Obama presidency in 2008 and the prospect of a re-election in 2012 saw a lot of new voters sort of enter the arena with what polls told us were high levels of enthusiasm, for example.
Right.
What's your sense of, now that we are looking at a Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders candidacy on the left, how do the dynamics of this sort of enthusiasm and interest level, which we already see from polling is not quite as high, although Bernie Sanders may be catalyzing a significant number of new voters, right, how do you think that will sort of interact at the same time that we have this very, very unusual tactic from a currently leading candidate on the right as Donald Trump? How will that play into the dynamics of the upcoming election?
Well, the best case scenario would be that turnout on the left and among progressive forces would equal or surpass that on the right. And we do know that a candidate like Trump, because he is a lightning rod both on his side but also for opposition, might be the one who can do that. I mean, we saw Duke do that. The reason Duke lost in 90 and 91, particularly 91 when he ran for governor, was because even though he galvanized his people, who very much wanted to see him run the state of Louisiana, black turnout in the governor's race was like 83, 84, 85% or something, which is just unheard of. It was equal to or higher than white voter turnout. So if Donald Trump were the nominee, it is certainly possible that the anti-Trump vote would be galvanized. The turnout among folks of color, among progressive whites, among Latinos would be high enough to ensure his defeat. But once again, I'm not sure, as someone who cares about the future of this country, that I want to take that risk and hope, let's say, because I've heard people say, well, hopefully Trump will get the nomination because he'll be destroyed. I never underestimate the ability of older white people to make the wrong decision and send this country backward in time. I've been white for a really long time, long enough to know that when we trust that white folks are going to do the right thing, particularly white folks of an older generation who nostalgize the past, we're engaging in some very dangerous hopes and dreams. And so I think we've got to do the work to make sure the turnout is good, because keep in mind, folks on the right are not taking anything for granted. They're throwing up as many roadblocks to voter access as they can, voter ID requirements that we know are not needed to stop voter fraud, closing down early polling stations, places like Alabama, which are already going to go Republican, making it virtually impossible for a lot of black folks in certain parts of that state to even get the ID that they're supposed to use to go vote. I mean, there are some definite attempts to steal this election, whether it's for Donald Trump or whomever else, by making it really, really hard for working class folks, particularly of color and younger folks, to vote. So as long as the left is good at galvanizing those people, I don't think that will work. But once again, I don't think we should take anything for granted in this country.
All right, words of warning from Tim Wise. Tim is an anti-racist educator, author of 6 books, including White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son. Tim, it's always great to talk to you. Thanks.
Thank you, David.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
A 49-year-old Kentucky woman named Laura Reed was arrested on accusations that she beat a disabled man with his own walking cane until it broke because he said he did not believe in God. 49-year-old Laura Reed was visiting the victim in his home. At one point, she asked him if he believed in God, according to police. The man reportedly jokingly said, "No, I don't believe in God." This inspired Reed to become so enraged by the answer that she allegedly picked up his metal cane and started beating him over the head and body with it until the cane broke. And then she robbed him of $50 and some other stuff, his cell phone and his credit cards or something like that. This man ended up crawling to a local gas station seeking help. Paramedics took him to a nearby hospital, and he suffered what are described as serious injuries. Not only did she beat the man, this also happened a while ago, and she was only taken into custody 2 days ago. She not only beat him, but also robbed him. Would Jesus be proud that she beat this man for not believing in him?
I'm going to guess that this woman is severely mentally ill. And not just in the way we talk about where people have very literal religious interpretations. And
serious mental illness.
I believe so. That being said, this story, I think, is still basically a perfect example of it's like the historical epitome of Christianity. You believe what we tell you, you read this book, you buy into it, or we beat you over the head with a cane.
Well, I think that most Christians today do not buy into the idea that people need to be beat if they don't accept Jesus as their Lord and Savior and plead the blood of Jesus.
No, but in the not too distant past, that was a pretty commonly held belief.
I said, oh, this is a member of like Yokul Haram or one of those groups. But then I started thinking, would a sane person ever beat the ever-loving crap out of someone, much less a disabled person, because of a difference of faith? That has to be mental illness. But we've been tricked in the past, Lewis, where there's a story like this, and we say clearly the person is mentally ill. And then they go to court and they say, no, I am completely in capacity of my faculties here. And I did this because the person does not believe in God and those people need to be punished. And then you say, okay, so are they fit to stand trial? I guess they are when they say that.
They can say that. It doesn't mean they aren't mentally ill. I mean, how do you define it? I mean, sure, they knew what they were doing. They made a conscious decision to do this because they were angry that the person didn't believe in God. But just the idea of the robbing, first of all, is what kind of signals me that
depraved.
That it's a little unusual.